is it as simple? I guess it's a very complex system, but if we really boil it down to the basics, is it really as simple as you had this legislation, which is like in the form of a white paper, I suppose, the different contents, and then you just go around getting signatures? Is that essentially how it works?
Not really. I guess there's really two ways that we can pass legislation, and I'll give two examples. And so one thing that I put up last year was a ban to convenience killing in pounds, which basically means the animals come in and they kill them because that's easier than trying to rehome them. And there was an incident of that in New South Wales recently, so we used that to get some media on it. Then we have to write the piece of legislation. Usually you're amending an act that already exists to change those laws. And there are people within Parliament that will help you actually write that legislation and make sure it's written the way that you want it to do and will have that kind of legal effect. Then you introduce it into Parliament with a long title. You do a second reading debate just yourself where you explain to people what the legislation will do and why it needs to be put forward. Then when you actually put the legislation up for a vote, you really need to go and talk to every one of those political parties and say, will you support this? Do you have any questions? Do you have any amendments? They can also amend what you're putting forward as well. And then when you take it down, you just have to hope that when you actually go to a vote, that the people who said that they would vote for your legislation will still be there, because you might be debating your legislation at 10 minutes to midnight. We're often there very late at night, and sometimes people go home or they feel sick. And so, your numbers might suddenly change. And also that obviously that they don't change their vote the last minute. Maybe somebody's gone and spoken to them and said, actually, can you vote against this? And so then you put that legislation forward. We put that forward, the convenience killing legislation. It passed in the upper house. I then go to a member in the lower house and ask them to introduce it there. So we often work with independent Alex Greenwich, who's the member for Sydney, and then he introduces the legislation in the lower house. Now, unfortunately, in the lower house, the government have the majority, which means that if they vote against it there, then the legislation won't go any further. But obviously passing it in the upper house will help you get media and attention on it. And it will also expose the government for failing to act on an important issue. The second way you can pass legislation, sorry, I'm being long-winded on this one.
Go for it.
The second way to pass legislation is really, like we did with tougher penalties. We went to the media. Every time there was a case where somebody was fined $200 for animal cruelty, we put out a media statement and we made sure we were constantly exposing the fact that New South Wales had the weakest penalties right across Australia, that the maximum fine for animal cruelty was $5,500. And that's why we were seeing these pathetic fines coming through the court systems. And so we kept bringing it up in the House. We bring it up in question times, in budget estimates, put the pressure on the minister. We had social media campaigns. We tagged the minister in our social posts. And just really bring it up constantly. And then we put in our own legislation. So we wrote our own legislation, then we got the numbers, then we told the government that we had the numbers. And so then the government put up their own legislation in an agreement that we wouldn't put our one up and actually take it to a vote. Now, their legislation wasn't as strong as ours, but then we can do the amendments. And then amendments are a lot easier to pass than legislation. So we're able to make it a bit stronger there. And then the legislation passed. So that's another sort of, it's a bit of an offshoot sort of pathway to do things, but it can work, especially if you've got the media on side.